So we actually got 4 movies this week, kind of surprisingly. So yeah, one finally got a wide release that I honestly didn't think was going to come here, but I guess it just is that big. So yeah, the more the merrier here. So obviously we're going to start with Ant-Man and the Wasp, which is an interesting direction to go immediately after Infinity War, because it was kind of like when I was talking about Infinity War, and I was saying that Thor Ragnarok was kind of like, because it was so, big and happy about itself and practically a comedy, it was like basically our last fun outing before shit got really real and really dark by the end of Infinity War. So it was like, now they've kind of got to do something in between that kind of gets us back to that more kind of happy attitude. So why not do the Ant-Man sequel here in this particular part of the timeline? Obviously, there's the big question of where exactly it lies in the timeline, and of course, eventually that question is answered, but it's kind of like, yeah, if you even thought about it for a second going in, yeah, it's probably in the place in the timeline you're probably thinking it is. Um, so that was kind of a no-brainer, really, but yeah, so it begins, and we do have, one of the things I'd always kind of been interested in was the whole idea of, Hank Pym and his wife basically being the original Ant-Man and the Wasp, and I did like at the very get-go, we do get to see them in action as the prologue, because of course we've got to do the de-aging thing in almost every prologue to a Marvel movie. Um, and then, obviously, we eventually get to the point to where we realize that maybe Michelle Pfeiffer wasn't completely and totally lost in the quantum realm. Of course not, because they cast Michelle Pfeiffer, and she's on the poster. So, and then naturally they have to rope Scott back into this, who is on house arrest because of what happened in Civil War, which is very funny. And he's being looked after like constantly, because there's just always the likelihood that a character like Scott Lang is not going to be able to stay out of trouble. Which is helped with the bonding time with his daughter, so there's stuff like that. He gets to develop more onto that, which was kind of a nice subplot in the first movie, like a sweet subplot in the first movie. And then as things take off and we kind of get back into the groove of things and everything, there's a lot to like here, but at the same time I couldn't help but notice pretty quickly that the novelty of the first one has kind of worn off pretty quickly, because it's such an interesting concept, especially for this world and all the different things that we got to see in the first movie. And there's still stuff in here, like the whole idea that the entire lab is a prop that is in jeopardy because it can be shrunk down to where it's just carried around. Pym carries it around like, rolling luggage and all that. But apart from stuff like that, it does kind of feel like it's sort of wearing thin a little bit, especially when we get a lot of, because much like the Thor movies have progressed into, these movies are surrounded a lot. They really, obviously, most of these are, but they're really all about the comedy too, especially now that Paul Rudd is officially credited as one of the writers. Um, and there's still definitely funny stuff in here, but I don't think the tangents don't quite work as well. Where there's a whole bunch of scenes of people just kind of talking back and forth frantically, and then somebody having to cut them off. There's a lot of that. There's things that they kind of maybe drag out more than they have to, like the whole Altoids thing, where it was really funny by itself, just as this thing. That he wanted that pack of Altoids, and Pym kept pushing it away from him. When they did it the first time, and obviously we know it's because he's clearly keeping something crucial in there that he doesn't want seen yet. But the fact that they play this joke out like 3 times is something that the movie tends to do quite a bit. Not to say they don't all not work. It's about half and half. Some of them do, but while we're on that, there's also the way it goes into the action also when we have, the big effects stuff, the effects are really great, even if they're played up for comedy, like when Scott can't quite his suit is malfunctioning at the time because it's a new one that's not completely done, so his size is just kind of constantly changing. In various situations, it never seems to line up the way it should. So that's very funny, and obviously, like I said, we've been doing the de-aging a lot. There's a point in time when Lawrence Fishburne is de-aged, and he basically looks like he does in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. So those hold up nicely, even if the comedy doesn't always. And as we're talking about, we do have new characters in this now. The thing I like most about the Pfeiffer subplot is that it really kind of gives, like, there was kind of an emotional thing going on with Scott and his relationship with his daughter and all that, and that was kind of this nice emotional foundation that the first movie had, despite all the other crazy shit that was happening. And this one has, like, a really nice emotional arc because of this storyline, because it's that he may be able to reunite with her, she may be able to reunite with her, and it's it does bring out these really big moments. I don't think Michelle Pfeiffer gets enough time to do something, to do more than she is capable of, but still, it is really nice to kind of have yet another sort of emotional foundation that really adds, like, a heart to the movie that really is a driving force, especially when it gets to the climax. And actually makes things feel like, when they happen in the action scenes, especially in the climax, that they're a really big deal, because obviously we know that, much as we all love these Marvel movies, they do the redundancy of the climax is apparent. So this kind of added something new to that we don't typically see, at least in as effective of a way, which is really nice. And yes, we do have our, basically our villain, who is Lawrence Fishburne, playing a character named Bill Foster, which, if I remember correctly, is Michael Douglas's name in Falling Down, so that's interesting. And I don't know if he's well, yeah, I would say he's one of the comic book characters because he has another name as well, but it's an interesting coincidence. But there's also the character of Ghost, which, by the way, it was really weird to me because I don't remember offhand them addressing or establishing that her name is that. It's just suddenly Scott kind of calls her that after the first time they've encountered. There's the first encounter, and then when he sees her suit again, she's just Ghost now. So, maybe I missed that establishment or whatever, but the thing about Lawrence Fishburne and Ghost is the idea that, throughout the entire movie, the interesting thing about the villains in this one is that they're like really conflicted, and they're not particularly strong villains or anything, but I do like that. I think that's kind of where that comes from, though, because you expect, big villains like, Ego or Thanos or somebody, but here we just kind of have these people who actually come from a certain place, a personal place too, especially with each other, and that they hardly get anything that sinister done, because that's hardly what even really the problem is, because they're just constantly self-conflicted, and they're almost as conflicted with themselves as they are the heroes trying to stop them, which is, like I said, it doesn't make them, like, particularly memorable villains, but in the confines of the story, it's just kind of a nice thing to see, and a nice direction for them to go. Another villain that keeps coming in here is Walton Goggins, who obviously we all always appreciate the presence of, especially when he's playing villains, but there is, like, even though the scenes are fun when he's in there and he does, like, cause trouble, it's like, he's one of those villains that's so insignificant, it's like, it just seems like it's so easy to stop him from doing what he's doing, despite how much trouble he actually causes. But, like, as far as a threat level, it seems like he's much more malicious, yeah, at the same time, he feels almost insignificant, so yeah, there's that. But it's still nice when he gets scenes, though. And then we've got Randall Park as the main kind of cop that's looking after Scott and making sure he doesn't do anything wrong. And he basically acts as an exposition machine, but the thing that makes that work is the fact that it's basically played up to be funny, the way he has so much information. And they play that out in a way to where it is painfully obvious they're just trying to throw out as much information and backstory as possible, and recap, but while at the same time making the character kind of funny. And with Randall Park being inherently funny, that helps a lot too, his casting. So, sort of like the casting of Hannibal Buress as the coach and the gym teacher in Spider-Man Homecoming. And then, obviously, we do have, like, Michael Pena and those dudes again. And while Michael Pena was, like, one of the big breakout characters of the first movie, and, like, who a lot of people consider one of the high points, one of the high comedy points, too, I do think that is one of the movie's biggest weaknesses here, is that comedy is just falling flat significantly more than it was before, and it's nothing that Pena and those guys are doing wrong. It's just that the writing oftentimes feels like kind of really desperate, and there's a few like awkward silences that probably shouldn't be there. And half the reason they're awkward silences is because the audience isn't reacting. But so that could have. But he does have like the big comedy scene of the movie is the whole truth serum thing, which is a big moment for his character. So he has that going for him, but yeah. So, but it doesn't, like I said, always land. Like I said, when I was talking about the novelty wearing off, that also means that the action scenes in this don't really feel as like thrilling or creative as the other. Like if this were the first movie and we had these action scenes in it, it'd probably feel maybe not quite to the extent that the first one did, but there'd probably be more there than there is now. And it's yeah, and but there are still creative touches. But the interesting thing about it is like one of the most creative scenes of the movie has nothing to do with an action scene and has nothing to do with CGI. And that's one of the opening scenes when Scott is dealing with his house arrest by basically simulating what it's like to be as small as he is with his daughter and making it like a game throughout the house. And it's like that's probably the most creative the movie gets, which is really interesting given the context. But yeah, that's still really good too. But talking about the big action scenes, there is one thing I would like to say about the climax, and that is, and more than what I've already said, but that is that this scene is so big, so unexpectedly big, because it's like, you know when you're watching action movies, and there'll be action scenes sprinkled out here and there, but then there's like the big one in the center. Like, my complaint was that Spider-Man Homecoming had two of these. It had the Washington Monument scene and it had the ferry scene. But there's usually just one of these scenes, and it's like the big middle action scene, and then later on we get the climax. But the interesting thing that this movie does is this climax is so big, it feels like that this action scene starts as the middle action scene, the centerpiece action scene, but is so big and so long, by the time it's over, it's become the climax. And I found that kind of interesting, actually, and the way they were able to really, pull that out. But it's actually, it does maintain excitement, which, like I said, is something that these Marvel movies are kind of starting to fail at slowly in their climaxes because they feel redundant. But this is like, because there's so many different missions going on at the same time, and we have to cut back and forth between two totally different things happening. But it somehow feels cohesive and actually works going back and forth, and actually feels like we're really, really building to something. Even if, once we do get to that final, when the climax is sort of dying down, everything's resolving itself, it does kind of feel like, oh, well, that was an awful lot of build-up for something that just kind of, was like a medium-sized firework, but still, it's actually kind of a really impressive climax, especially with the two totally different big things that we keep cutting back and forth with, which I like. So, and then it is a movie that just kind of feels reliable, which some people might just kind of brush off as like safe and, pointless or whatever, but it's like, it's the kind of movie, when I say reliable, I mean stuff like as you're watching it, it's like, just as you start to think, it's probably about time for another action scene, an action scene will just happen, like right when you expect it to, or when it's like, oh, this will be the downtime, or this will be the time for like a big comedy scene or whatever to break the tension or whatever. And all these things pretty much come exactly as you expect them to. Like, you can say like almost everything like right before it happens. Like, this will be that thing, and then that scene happens, and so on until the end. But the thing about that, too, is even though it may seem, like, safe and, like, too predictable and all that, it also is kind of nice to have... It feels like it has a secure structure because of this. Like, this is the kind of thing where they do have quite a few things going on, so it could have felt, like, really all over the place. But this whole kind of, for lack of another word, predictable nature of it does make it feel like it's competently put together, at least. So it really just kind of depends on how you take that kind of thing. But I didn't mind that overall if it felt a little predictable, only because it still felt like it was in control of itself, which is really important too, just as important. So yeah. So, but like I was saying, it doesn't. The novelty just kind of isn't there, and it doesn't feel as exciting as it once did in the first movie. And the comedy falls flat a lot more than it did before. But like I said, that's not to say that there's not still some good stuff in there on all these counts. So, and the cast is always really great. Michael Douglas gets a whole lot to do this time, which he's great at. He's somehow interesting enough, despite his age and his past filmography, is right at home in these movies. It doesn't feel like they just brought in the big name actor to do the somewhat small part and then that's it. He gets like a lot to do here and really plays off this material nicely, so that's great. And plays on Paul Rudd nicely and Evangeline Lilly, of course, so yeah. And lastly, this is actually something that has been an idea, but I just haven't mentioned it, but there was a comment on my Infinity War review, to my understanding, and mentioned that there should be like a kind of versus thing where we talk about all the movies. Yeah, before Infinity War even came out, that's actually been a plan. It's gonna be me and my brother, and it's gonna be basically like we did that James Bond video where we kind of split up into categories like our top five, whatever, whether it be the heroes, the villains, the big moments, the climaxes, whatever. Just going through like every aspect of the series. And that's going to be like probably a month or so from now. Shortly before Infinity War's DVD release, to my understanding. So if that interests you, that's going to be there in a month or so. So, yeah, I think we can move on to another franchise movie. I guess we're going to go into the First Purge now. And this one, obviously it may feel a little different because the guy, James DeMonaco, I think is his name, the guy that's written and directed all the movies up to this point, he wrote this one, but he's not the director. I think he's doing like some movie with Naomi Watts or something. So he handed the directing job off to somebody else. And yeah, obviously, as the title tells us, and since the Purge was abolished in election year, it's like, well, we gotta keep this going somehow. Let's just go back to the beginning and start there. So we have that. And before I even go into this, I will just say, hopefully I'm not too all over the place here because, and I mention this because I feel like it's kind of telling to the movie itself. I don't hate this movie or anything. I don't even really find this movie that boring or anything, but the problem is that usually I saw this movie yesterday because it came out Wednesday. And usually when you see a movie, you kind of think about it all day, or at least kind of keeps occurring to you all day, and there's certain aspects of it that you kind of keep going back to and maybe kind of analyzing your head a little bit when you like space out or whatever. After I saw this movie yesterday, I, for some reason, just really did not even think about it again. Like maybe once or twice briefly, and then it was just gone. It was like, by the end of yesterday, after I had seen it, I felt like I had seen it like a week ago. When I'd only seen it like 4 hours ago. It felt like a week ago. So, I don't know quite what that says about the movie, but yeah, that's how it was. So we get introduced to a bunch of new characters, mainly through this interview process where the government's trying to decide who's going to get paid to do certain things throughout it. They're going to get paid to stay home. They're going to get paid to purge. They're going to try to make it, spread as much as they possibly can. And the first person we meet is this dude named Skeletor. I don't quite know what the fuck problem Skeletor has, apart from drugs, but there's got to be more to it than that. Like, his gums are bleeding, he's got, like, these weird face tattoos, almost like brands or something. And he's just got this really, really inherently psychotic way about him. He says basically to get through life, these are his words, not mine, fucks his lungs with smog. And he's they basically set it up like he's gonna be our antagonist. He takes needles and he, like, tapes them to his Knuckles, and that's his weapon of choice before he just has a giant blade eventually. um, and so he's kind of interesting when he pops in and out. There's always like that one character in these movies that you just kind of wait for that you know is going to cause the most havoc. He's that one for this, and he's easily the most interesting character. But we also have Dimitri, who's like our gang dealer or whatever that's kind of at the head of this. And his story actually starts off, it feels like it's like half the movie, where it's basically just like, almost like a gangster movie or something, kind of like if anybody saw Blue Hill Avenue, like that movie kind of feels like half of the First Purge, because of this character. But he's a pretty hard-ass character, and he's an interesting choice to kind of be the one, because there's also always the one character that we like sort of follow throughout, that's kind of the one we're kind of waiting to see if they get to the end or not. And so yeah, like the character types are here, but the characters are different. So depends on how much these characters resonate with you, whether you feel like you're watching the exact same movie that you usually do or not. I don't think most of them are particularly that memorable. There's one point where there's the brother and sister, and they do like this little thing when they greet each other when they're leaving, and it's like, oh, they got a secret handshake. Something tells me that's going to be the only way this movie tells us that they're close. But and I underestimated it a little bit. They do kind of they get a lot of scenes together, especially in the second half, and we do get to see some characters band together here, but even so, they all still feel like pretty weak for the most part. I think that's pretty consistent with the series. I know some people like really, really took to Anarchy a lot. Like Anarchy's like, to my understanding, getting more well liked as time goes on, and as these movies get worse, I guess. But no, the thing here is that there are some of these characters who are introduced, but then they just kind of very quickly don't matter. Like there are some characters that just die unceremoniously, and some of them are kind of major characters. But it's kind of like you start to kind of think, well, maybe that's the movie's way of saying, like, this is to show like the lack of value of human life. That no matter how important a character seems, they can just be just like that, like frustratingly nonchalantly killed. But it doesn't really feel like that. It just kind of feels like, after a while, the movie gets in a big old damn hurry, and the characters just never mattered, come to think of it. No matter how much introduction they got, no matter how much they try to show you how much they matter to other people, in the long run, they just really don't. Like I said, that could be a commentary thing, like maybe the way the government sees, regular citizens or whatever, but it doesn't feel like it's smart enough or invested enough to portray anything like that effectively, for it to seem intentional if it is. And there's also kind of as the series has gone on, we've gotten the lack of familiar faces becomes more or less prominent. We started off with Ethan Hawke and Lena Headey and all them, and then we kind of go down the chain. We had Keith Stanfield in the second movie. Michael T. Williamson, I think, was one of them. And then as we go down the line, we had Elizabeth Mitchell, and now we've got Marissa Tomei as basically the head of things, who seems like she did all her stuff in post-production. She seems like she's barely here. And she's on, if they shot this in, Staten Island or whatever, it's like she was doing her scenes in, L.A. or something, and just, sent them in. So it's and it does, after a while, make you wonder, what's even the point? Melanie Diaz is in here, kind of. Which is really interesting, because she was just in the Belko Experiment last year with very similar scenes and kind of a very similar approach. And yeah, so as it goes on, they do some things that are interesting, and when you talk about the concept of the First Purge, and it's the news has a whole debate of why are they wearing masks? Nobody told them to do that. It's stuff that the news probably would waste their time debating if this actually happened. Not about the loss of human life, no. Why are they wearing masks? They're not supposed to do that. And then there's the point in time that's kind of clever, to where it's it doesn't go off right away. And the government people are just kind of watching all the monitors dude, nothing's happening. And it's they're just kind of waiting for that one. They're waiting for Skeletor to do his job, basically. And then shit will eventually go off. Kind of. It is one of those cases where it's I know some people. I was pretty kind to the first movie. And people obviously hated it because they thought it just completely threw away the concept. It didn't do the concept justice, and it's like it really made you want to know like what was out there. And while I thought that Anarchy in Election Year did, really try to make up for that, I don't. It just still feels like these movies are missing something, and that's especially apparent in this one, to where it's like there's certainly times where we do feel that chaos, but it just doesn't feel consistent enough, I don't think. And like I said, there's times where it like maybe focuses on things that it probably shouldn't. Like I said, I know that's what some people thought the entirety of the first movie was, but I don't know, I still feel like maybe it's because they feel a little like, obviously coming from Blumhouse, they're gonna feel very low budget, and maybe that has something to do with it also. But this one kind of especially feels very, very low budget. But yeah, there are movies that come off much cheaper. Like, it doesn't feel necessarily like they just... Okay, maybe it does kind of feel like they just kind of threw this together, but there are still certain moments where it does kind of feel like you can really feel just the complete insanity of it. But it just never really seems to get there in like a big way, to where you really feel like it just really has a peak to it. It just kind of finds its groove and then just kind of like stays there. And I feel like that's kind of what the movies have pretty much done throughout the series, and in my opinion anyway. And yeah, you do have those moments where it does feel like they're trying too hard to be disturbing. There's the guy that has the mask that's like the crying baby doll heads or whatever. And it's like, I understand what they're going for, but it's just not getting there. It feels way too much like they were really trying to go for it, but maybe just a little too much. And it kind of has the opposite effect. And yeah, and talking about, how it just kind of feels cobbled together, maybe possibly just as a cash grab. It's like, at the point in time when we see the Halloween poster up in the room, and I believe it's the Halloween poster for the David Gordon Green movie that's coming out from this same company later this year, and it's kind of like, how very Sony of you to do something like that, to advertise yourself like that. So that also kind of maybe cheapens it a little bit, but there's always the defense of, you could say, pretty much anything in this movie that you can critique could also be defended as saying it's part of the commentary. But the problem is that this is a movie that obviously takes a lot from real life and its particular situations, and kind of basically tries to show it as, this is where we're headed, or this is an exaggerated version of what we currently are, or whatever like that. But the thing about it is the movie doesn't really feel like it's using that to its advantage. It's just kind of putting it there without really any impact. So it sort of reminds me of, like, when you saw those really shitty spoof movies like Epic Movie and all those, and it was like, they didn't parody movies, and they didn't use other aspects of other movies to better themselves or to say something about that thing. They just took it, they put it in theirs just for people to say, I recognize that. I know what that is because I've seen that before. And that's what it feels like this movie's doing with real life. It's just kind of taking it, but it doesn't really do anything to make the movie more impactful, and it's not saying anything impactful about what's going on. It's just saying, hey, this is that thing from real life. And that's all they have to say. And the movies seem to really think that they're making some powerful statement about current affairs and all that, but no, that's just all it feels like, is they're just pointing the finger and saying that thing has happened. But we kind of know that because we're living in it. We acknowledge that exists. It's just a matter of, what are you going to do to make it impact your movie, or make this movie impact that? And of course, these are not going to be the movies that do that. No matter how much they want to, these will not be those movies. But as, this sort of action/horror/ just chaotic, holy shit, all the things going on here, it's not terrible or anything. I mean, it, like, does its job, but it doesn't have, like, some of the creative visuals, which, once again, may be intentional, because it's like, because we're seeing The Purge in its early stages before, by the time we get to election year, when people are, like, covering their cars in lights and shit, all that stuff, but bringing, like, giant guillotines out and stuff like that. It's like, I guess I can understand with this being, like, the first one, if it feels a bit more bare bones than the others. But kind of like, the really, crappy traps in Jigsaw when we learned the twist of where that movie was in the timeline. It makes sense, I guess, but still, you know, what's that do to the entertainment value but dampen it, but bring it down and make it feel watered down and all that. So, yeah, like I said, I get it, but, you know, as far as where you are in the franchise right now, is this really what you should be doing? And once again, given where we are in the franchise, if we had gone along with the timeline, there wouldn't be a Purge anymore. So it's kind of like, maybe take the hint from yourselves and maybe keep it that way. But, you know, we're getting a whole TV show or miniseries or whatever the fuck it is. So there's that. So that's pretty much all that is. If I thought, you know, when I saw it yesterday felt like a long time, that does feel like a long time ago. I saw this yesterday. That's just gonna get farther and farther out of my memory as we go. So that's what I remember as of now. So yeah. So we talk about, you know, everybody wanting to eat each other alive today in movies like The Purge. So let's kind of go in the complete opposite direction, in a movie that's almost seems to want to intentionally combat movies like the Purge movies, where we have Won't You Be My Neighbor, the Mr. Rogers documentary, which obviously is going to have a bit of a companion piece later when we have the movie where Tom Hanks actually plays him. I think You Are My Neighbor is the name of that one. So, I wonder how much confusion that'll cause. So, yeah, so I always am not quite sure how to approach talking about documentaries, because it's sort of the thing where usually end up talking, it ends up becoming more of a discussion about the subject than it does the movie itself and how it's put together. But we'll see how this goes. I think the dude that made this is the one that made, a dude or a woman, I can't remember which, quite honestly. The person that made 20 Feet from Stardom made this. And basically we're looking at what we know to be a documentary about a dude that used the medium of TV to get his message out there, while at the same time detesting most of what TV stood for and what it was showing, and basically took responsibility for his own medium, and basically tried to make up in the right way what the rest of the medium was doing in the wrong way. And Mr. Rogers is something that I didn't exactly grow up with consistently. I saw it, like, here and there. And over the years, you know, been catching up with it on YouTube and stuff like that, as he's really kind of taken on this sort of great, I don't know that notoriety is the right word, but a newfound popularity in the internet age. As people realize that his, you know, life lessons and his outlook in general are so incredibly valuable, as the world is just getting more and more jaded with all the bad stuff that's happening and all that. And the interesting thing about watching Mr. Rogers is the way that he sort of, and basically everything I'm saying here is, you know, shown in the documentary, so it's relevant. So they basically talk about how he's has this way with children that we really rarely see in such an effective way, to the point that it's almost like, because his mind was kind of already there, like the bullying and the way that he, you know, was more or less tortured throughout his childhood, he was able to kind of keep the innocence of childhood and basically use that to better the things that once happened to him and are now happening to so many other people that would watch his show, just nationwide. So, and he would, one of the things to really notice was the way that he, there's one episode that I noticed this, that the documentary didn't talk about, was, because I'm sure it was consistent throughout, but this one episode really stands out to me. When he's watching, they're watching a tape on how balloons are made in a factory, and he's like constantly asking questions to things that we probably know we'll get the answers to if we just keep watching. But the interesting thing is that he knows, like, the way children's minds work, and the way that these are all the questions they're probably asking. That's what children do. They ask questions way prematurely. If they would just pay attention, they would get answers. So to keep these children entertained and make sure to show that he was on their level, he's watching this and asking all those questions prematurely that he knows children will be asking at this point as they watch these particular parts. And just that's just one little example that's always stuck out to me in regards to how he understands the way children see things so clearly. Um, and then the way also that he was able to use the puppets and basically not only bring out his own personality through them, but obviously how they were based on the personalities of people in his family, which is something I didn't know until this documentary. And even the ones that were portrayed maybe not as flatteringly, still ultimately took it in a flattering way and are laughing about it. And obviously through his personality coming out through these fictional characters and these inanimate objects, the documentary shows something in a really interesting way, and that is, it's something that actually the documentary seems to point out without saying it before somebody just flat out says it, and that is that he seemed to, when you see, this is a weird example to bring in with Mr. Rogers, but when you hear about Seth MacFarlane and what he does with the Family Guy voices and how, like, you know, he does a certain type and a certain voice for Stewie and for Quagmire and for Peter and all them, but when he's Brian, it's basically his own outlook through this particular character, and it's basically the personification of him. And that's basically what Daniel Tiger was for Mr. Rogers, where he was using a different voice, obviously a more sort of like, kid-friendly voice to be more soothing to them and more kind of make them more, I guess, prone to paying attention. But still, his personality and the things that Daniel Tiger would ask and the things that he was like contemplating, that was when he was like in his most real moments when he was doing any character really, besides just himself talking to the camera or whatever. And so there are these animations throughout it as they're talking about the way he saw the world and how he tried to deal with certain things. And it's like animations of Daniel Tiger doing these things. So it's like before they even mention that was basically his outlet for himself. The movie's already portraying this through that animation, and that stuff is really well done also. And just basically watching the way he handled certain people that obviously the whole, being in front of the Senate thing is a video that's been going around forever, and the way he turned that guy around. But there's also other examples of that the movie depicts, like when there's a particular TV host, and he's being like, he's trying to be as friendly as he can about it and be on Mr. Rogers' level of understanding and basically say, I really don't want this to seem like, a terrible question and like I'm trying to say something that's not true, but it's like, are you really the way that you are on TV? And to see this guy kind of taking this approach, and this ends up paying off by this guy ends up talking to Daniel Tiger as if he were a person. It's basically the way you keep hearing about the Muppets and how, like, when no matter anybody from like a child to Ray Liotta does a movie with a Muppet, and they all say the same thing. It's like the Muppet is its own person. It's like the Muppet is right there and is alive, and you find yourself talking to them, not even thinking about the idea of a puppeteer. And it's like Mr. Rogers was able to do this same thing while he was sitting right there. And it's like he's not even doing like a ventriloquist thing. He is just openly moving his mouth, just doing this voice, just with the puppet. And he could still get that same way that the people feel about the Muppets. Even if you're not face-to-face with the puppeteer itself. He can make you feel like you were talking to a puppet as if it were a real person. And we see this happen with the TV host kind of like reluctantly. But then once the puppet is put away, we kind of see it registering with the TV host like, like, wow, that felt real, like I was talking to a real person, and just kind of to watch that dawn on him is just kind of something really special. And talking about like some of the techniques the movie does, one thing I thought was quite interesting is that, and there's something that kind of goes against this a little bit as it goes on towards the end, but the way that it jumped around in regards to how old Mr. Rogers was at the time some of these things were happening, like, sometimes we'll see him like in the 60s, then it'll like jump to the 80s, then it'll be like the 70s, then it'll be like the early 2000s. And it'll just really kind of jump around, and we kind of see his aging just kind of seems to constantly change throughout it, the way they lay out the timeline. But the interesting thing about that is that when we see him, no matter what he looked like, just everything was consistent, whether it be the show or the way he approached things, the way he talked to people. Just throughout all those years, no matter how much his age changed, it all just kind of felt it felt very consistent. And I feel like that was kind of sort of like a way of showing that, of not necessarily just saying, well, this is how he was in the 60s, then the 70s, then the 80s, and just doing it in chronological order like that. How they didn't mind kind of jumbling up the footage a little bit. So I thought that was really well done also. And it does kind of show a lot of things that you, like when you hear about, you know, a Mr. Rogers documentary and you think about the fact that pretty much everybody considered him basically a saint. Like, all over the internet, you'll see questions like, you'll see statements like, I'm an atheist, but I believe Mr. Rogers was a saint, stuff like that. And so you kind of think, you feel like a documentary might seem a bit one-sided or closed-minded if it depicts its subject in just one particular way. But the movie's not afraid to show him in the ways, in other sort of darker ways. But even then, obviously the darker ways are not, you know, like, it basically gets to a point where, like, maybe sometimes he would feel like he was losing hope. Or there's times where, when he was angry, he would do it through the puppets or his piano playing. He'd hit the keys a little harder sometimes. But with the contrast of his nature, it's kind of like, it's hard to look at that in a cynical way, because it's like, oh, you know, there's got to be, you know, some fabrication of this, because everybody gets really angry and all that. But the interesting thing about that, and you hear that, but as you're watching the documentary and you see the contrast, you realize, like, even though it doesn't seem like it'd be really this outlet for anger, or to, like, talk through a puppet or to hit piano keys, but it's like, when you see the contrast within the movie, in the footage, it does seem like when we see him talking slightly angrily through a puppet or just hitting piano keys slightly harder, there's a big difference in his demeanor. You can tell that there's, like, an anger in him, but like I said, compared to anybody else, it's just so sort of light in that way. So it does make it feel like, yeah, that really is the person he was, and that's... But the documentary shows it in a way to where it makes it more believable that he was that way by showing it the way that they do. And of course there was stuff that, like, made him unhappy sometimes, like the way, like some of his parodies, like they bring up the... Like, and there's always that kind of contrast there also, to where it's kind of like, we think he's going to get mad about Eddie Murphy and what he did, but the story he decides to tell is, when I saw Eddie Murphy and I met him, the first thing he did was hug me and say, there's the real Mr. Rogers. And it's like, he still turned that into a positive thing, even though he was talking about the fact that, even though some of the parodies are funny, a lot of them could be damaging. With the way they take this positive message and make a joke out of it could basically ruin the impact to a more... somebody that's susceptible to taking things at surface level like that. And then there's the whole thing about when one of the cast members turned out to be gay and he found out, and it was because of the time that it was like, his initial reaction was, you can't do that, and you can't let people, you know this, or we're going to get shut down. But then just really, just very quickly, that turns into, well, he accepted it, and they dealt with it, and his wife says they had plenty of gay friends. And it's just like, even though those moments are there, he always kind of found a way to turn them upside down, or turn them into a positive direction, and sort of keep them from turning into anything negative whatsoever. And there's even in the stuff when they go into, like, when he dealt with, like, death and divorce and stuff like that, he still found those ways to make sure that children could see that stuff and make sure, or deal with that stuff, but not take it in, like, this traumatizing direction to say, like, you know, this is the world and it's going to mess with you, because he knew that would make everybody jaded, like a lot of people are now. And so he was able to take that in such a sensitive way to get children to understand it, but then know how to basically better themselves in those situations should they find themselves in them. So, and yeah, all this is portrayed quite well through all this. And they even bring in the criticism about people saying, like, that whole news thing came out a while back about, like, it's Mr. Rogers' fault that everybody's so narcissistic because of the way he said that everybody is special and all that. And they basically tried to do everything they could, for whatever reason, to make it seem like people just can't comprehend that there would be somebody like this with so much positivity, and they just absolutely positively have to find some kind of negative in it. Which is something that you kind of see more and more now, where everybody just wants to see the negative in anything for whatever reason. To where it's like I guess it's sort of this thing of, like, because you're so jaded by the world at this point, if you were to see somebody like Mr. Rogers for like the first time nowadays, you would just you would feel like you were being bamboozled because you just know that everything has some kind of dark side to an extent. So you just automatically assume. And then there's things like you look at the Cosby thing, for instance, and you see like a figure that's just this thing that's looked upon as this grand thing and this positive thing, this thing that everybody looked up on, and then the world has taught you that the more higher on the pedestal somebody is, probably the darker what behind the scenes is. So you get an understanding of where people are coming from with that. And that's probably certainly the way, he would see it, as regards to being able to understand why people would be so negative towards the good things he was doing for whatever reason. And then it gets into the whole... And there is sort of a down... Like, when you think about this movie, you must think that there's, like... You go in thinking that there must be, like, this outlook. People are saying, like, some of the critics are praising it and saying, like, it's this burst of positivity that we need. But that's not to say the movie doesn't go in some depressing directions. Like, one of the things towards the end is the whole... When people were, picketing outside his funeral, saying that, he supported fags or whatever, and... The fact that, and the really depressing thing about the fact that these people were bringing their children into this, and it was like just the absolute, total, exact opposite of what he was doing. How he was using all of his resources to fight stuff like this, and to get children to see the good in things at an early stage so that they could take that through their lives, and to see these kids in these early stages being roped into stuff like this. And it's just, and it kind of shows you this is, it does show you in the sense of all this is good because this is what he was fighting against, but then at the same time it's like, this is the world post him, and it's like, this stuff still is happening, and it's gonna, and as the more jaded the world gets, the worse it's probably gonna get, and it does kind of send you in this kind of depressing, pessimistic direction when you see stuff like that. But it's still, it does kind of seem to want to leave you with that, surely, like one of the, final thoughts is that there are other Mr. Rogerses out there, we just may not see them, they may not be on TV, and we may not want to think that there's, other people like that out there, there's more than one, but somewhere there is, and so it does leave you with that sort of kind of positivity, and the fact that you yourself could be that person, really does kind of leave that lesson that he left and kind of brings it into this movie and tries to leave its audience with that also. So yeah, and it does show some of the different directions he attempted to go in, like just when you think, if he was just specific to kids, it shows that he did try to do that show where he did similar things only with adults, and it didn't quite pan out the way he thought it would or hoped that it would. And then there's stuff, like I said, where it's not all positivity, but it does give you the realism on top of it, because it is sort of like, where the criticism comes from, where it's like people fear that his outlook was so ideal that maybe some children would think it was, unrealistic to be that positive. But then we have scenes like the scene where they say that Mr. Rogers seemed to really be, his inner doubts seemed to be really coming out through this Daniel Tiger duet that they did, where it was like, he basically said, like, was I a mistake, am I worthless and stuff like that, and she says, like, well, no, I like you just the way you are, his little catchphrase, but then it's like, Daniel Tiger didn't come around that much like you would in real life. It's like he was still, even in the face of, no, I like you just for who you are, and you're special just like everybody else is special, Daniel Tiger's response was just, I still feel like, bad. And it's like, it did show that not everything was just as easily fixed as saying, well, there's good in the world and you're a part of that. The end. It did show that they didn't always take the easy way out, just like in real life that you couldn't. So yeah, they do show all those different aspects of that also. So yeah. And then, like I said, there's the whole... It does kind of leave you a bit... it tries to leave you with that optimism, but there's also a little bit of pessimism in there, too, because it's like... You do realize the tragedy of... Like I was saying, it's... Basically, when somebody like Mr. Rogers is around now, it's seen as, like, weird. by most people. Like, there's, like, you can't see a dude having a relationship with children the way that he did without people immediately saying he must be a pedophile behind closed doors or something like that. And like I said, that's just kind of the way the world has, like, adapted itself, unfortunately, and it's like, and it does kind of leave you with that sort of, it's sort of a depressing thought that we can't have people like Mr. Rogers without people immediately thinking that. And yeah, so that sort of gives it like kind of a tragic vibe too, but the optimism is definitely in there, and that's definitely the point they want to convey more than anything. Why else would they tell Mr. Rogers a story if they didn't want to do that? So, yeah. So like I said, it was like, end up talking more about the subject than you do the documentary itself, but the documentary put itself together in ways that make all these points very apparent. So, yeah, that's what that is. So we're going to end on going back to crime after that. Let's go into John Travolta's Gotti movie. This was basically his passion project for a long time. And I was actually, like, really excited about this when, like, it was going to be him, like, Barry Levinson was going to direct it, and it was going to be, like, this really big thing. I think they had a really nice cast list building, too. But then it just kind of kept falling down. They kept, losing certain aspects of it, and then eventually they've been trying to cobble it together, and he basically we've gone from Barry Levinson to Kevin Connolly. Yes, Kevin Connolly from Entourage directed this. And it has stuff like, they're having Pitbull do a song, and then Pitbull said, hey, why don't I do the score, like the whole score through the movie. So the movie's directed by Kevin Connolly from Entourage and has a Pitbull score. Something tells me this would not have been the Barry Levinson movie we'd have gotten. So, and it's not necessarily certain if we got the movie Travolta wanted, which I'm going to assume probably not, because there are aspects of this movie that you can almost see, like, this could have been Travolta's Black Mass. And if you're familiar at all, I know it had its criticism, but if you're familiar with my opinions at all, you know that that's a really big... I thought Black Mass was like a top 5 movie of 2015. And this movie could have been Travolta's Black Mass. And there are certain aspects of it to where you can kind of see it kind of in there. And it's like it's being basically, put forward as like a low-rent Goodfellas, basically. And you can kind of see the problems sort of immediately, starting with like the way the timeline is. Like I was just talking about with the documentary, doesn't work as well here. Because there are these very jarring cuts between time, and it's like, even though it kind of tells you the time at the bottom, it still sort of feels like it's cutting around everywhere, and sometimes you're not quite sure where you are, and there's no cohesion here. Like, there's no reason that one scene goes into another, or what they're talking about in this scene leads into this scene from 20 years ago, or this scene that's like 20 years later. It all just feels like it's just bouncing around and trying to say a whole lot at the same time, while not really saying much of anything because it doesn't give itself enough time to. And to top that off, it's bookended by this narration from the grave, but the narration from the grave is in person, like he's standing next to the bridge and he's talking to the camera. But then sometimes he's also seems to be narrating in the moment and not from the grave. It's weird. I feel like they were trying to, like, they were starting to make one movie, and then they were basically like, oh, let's scrap this, let's try to make this entirely different movie, and then we'll find our groove. And then somehow, like, these two cuts sort of ended up together. and it's the result you can imagine. And it makes you feel really bad for Travolta, because I've been a fan of Travolta, like, forever. I know he's like the butt of a lot of jokes, and the media really loves to go after him. But he's just... when he brings it, there's nothing really like it coming from him. And with this being a passion project, and this being such a big character to play, you can sense that there's, like, there are some scenes in this movie to where he's just, like, on fire. And it's this amazing thing to watch, and it's like, you can just tell that there was there was a great movie that could have stemmed from this performance. But then there's other times where the movie doesn't let him do it justice, and there'll be, like, 1 minute it'll be like, holy shit, this is some of the best stuff Travolta's ever done. But then the next scene, it'll be like, I feel like they gave Travolta one take. Like, I feel like that scene he just did was the first take, and that's the one they went with before he really got to warm up into it. And that really just does him a disservice, and his passion for this a big disservice. And then there's obviously some scenes that should be, like, really big. Like, there is a scene, to get into some sensitive subject matter. Obviously, if you know the story, you know that ultimately they will lose a child. A son. And obviously Kelly Preston is also playing his wife in the movie. So it's like, in this scene where the characters played by John Travolta and Kelly Preston lose their son, and you know that this is something that has happened in real life, you realize that there's like a real emotion at the core of this scene in its conception, not just, you know, them being actors. And you feel like there should be something really powerful there. But once again, the movie itself just, like, refuses to do it justice. And make it feel like this really big emotional moment that hits, because the movie's just too intent on getting to the next thing. It hardly wants to linger on something and let it, you know, simmer or whatever before it does its thing. And it just kind of wants to, you know, hit certain things. It's like it went through the Wikipedia page. It was just like, well, we'll do this part, and we'll do this part, and we'll do this part. Maybe not in that order. And we got to make sure we do that. And with hardly showing the repercussions, hardly showing the build-up to it, just showing the thing itself, or at least the hit point. And it's also, like, and there's sometimes in that sense where it's kind of, sort of like, it's just so throwing it out there like nothing. It's almost like, not only did it feel like they took from Wikipedia, but they're trusting you as an audience member to have read Wikipedia before you even see this. Which is just poor storytelling, just from the get-go. And then it's also, like, and there's characters that you feel like are, like, a really big deal, like Stacy Keach, for instance, or Pruitt Taylor Vince, or whatever. But they just kind of feel like they're just kind of background characters that you feel like probably were really important, but this movie's not going to convey that, because it's just interested in going from one event to the other, with really only one thing at its center, and that's... And the background is basically just, hey, remember this guy that had a couple of scenes? Well, he's dead now. This guy that had a couple of scenes, he's dead now. And that's it as it goes on to this thing. And it even feels like, after a while, the stuff he's going to prison for is starting to get vague. And it's like, especially when he goes away for good, it's sort of like, well, I feel like that should have been presented in a way that's a bigger deal than they showed it. But it seems like they were just kind of in a hurry to get to that point to make it come full circle, so they can stop jumping around so much, which they're going to still do anyway. And there's some stuff to where it's kind of like, one of the joys of movies like this is, well, one of the guilty joys, I guess, especially since a lot of these are true stories and these are real people, is seeing the way these things work, like seeing the mechanics of their business. And this, once again, the movie just wants to kind of just scoot right on by those things. Like, we have, like, the driver that killed their kid. It's like, we know there's going to be this big elaborate thing of how they, you know, made him pay for that. And it's just done all... They just talk about it in news footage, briefly, and that's it. That's the big payoff to that. And then they do the same thing with the dude that ends up being the informant. It's just like, you think there's going to be some big old thing they play out, maybe bring in a suspenseful scene, something at least to make some memorable scene. Nope, they just kind of mention it in dialogue once, and it's gone. It's like this movie thinks it's the Roaring Twenties, the movie with James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart, the movie that was like, it was like the mob movie that was like half the dialogue was it being told through like news footage, which was that movie's style, so it made sense. But here it's just like, it feels like laziness, like they're trying their best to cut to the chase, and it's like, well, we don't have the money to film that kind of stuff, and we don't have the creativity to write that stuff to make it more movie-like, make it more cinematic, so we'll just brush through it with news footage or whatever. And it feels lazy, and like it's just not all... It feels incomplete, actually. Like those movies that are incomplete back in the day, so they just put, like, you know, still frames in. That's kind of what it feels like. Just put the still frames in their place. And so that's really unfortunate. And it's like, you can sense, like, when some of the big moments are supposed to be. Like, there's one particular moment that's a big deal for Gotti, and you can hear the music almost sounds like Michael Corleone becoming the Godfather type music or something. And it's like, Pitbull doing the score for a movie like this doesn't end up as ridiculous as it sounds. Like, he's trying to kind of do the sort of mob feel or whatever, but yeah, it's just not hitting. But I mean, in regards to what the critical consensus is, it is a bit overblown. This isn't one of the worst movies ever made. It's a very disappointingly made movie. It feels lazy. It feels incomplete. It feels like there's a great performance at its center that they just really didn't care to give the time of day. But I mean, the movie already did kind of get a bad reputation because of the whole Twitter thing, to where it was like, it and MoviePass were basically trying to like build it up so people would go to it. So they were saying like, critics are like keyboard warriors or something, like audiences really know where it's at or something. That old thing. The studio was like doing this, and they really just embarrassed themselves and made themselves a laughing stock, which did not do the movie's reputation any favors. Obviously, you can compare it a lot to the TV movie with Armand Assante, this one, which is fine. You know, it's very much a TV movie, but Asante's really great in it, and it tells the story better to my memory, if my memory serves correct. And I remember it does feel like it sort of hits the points in a bit more of an effective way. Like I said, even as a TV movie. So I would even this one on the back. The Chicago sometimes compared this one to Goodfellas, and just like in a much more positive light. So I would say if you're somewhat interested in seeing a movie version of this, that exists, but there's also, you know, like documentaries and shit which probably serve you much better. So yeah, so that's what that ended up being, unfortunately. So that's it for this week. Next week, I think we have, what is it, Skyscraper might be next week, Hotel Transylvania, I think. I do have premeditated plans to see Hotel Transylvania, of all things. I don't know if it will be this week or this coming week or the following week, but it'll be somewhere in there. And then all that stuff. We continue sequel July, and we've got, you know, like The Equalizer coming up and stuff like that. So all that stuff. And then I'm continuing the Best Picture winning musicals versus, so we have all that. So yes, so as July goes in all these scheduled directions, I think that's it.